As a fearsome leader and warrior, King Henry V seemed invincible. That is, until he came down with a mysterious illness in 1421. While he seemed to recover, one fatal mistake spelled his doom. Immortalized beyond the pages of history books, Henry V became the subject of many literary works. While many were quick to celebrate him as a hero king who led Britain to greatness against its enemies, others have since pointed out that he may not be as noble as previously thought. Born on September 16th, 1386, Henry may have been far from succeeding the throne, but he was still royalty. His father, Henry IV, was a cousin of King Richard II. But family ties weren't everything, and Henry IV went into exile in 1398 for his part in a revolt against the king. As a result, King Richard took 12-year-old Henry into his care. Henry's time with Richard II would be short-lived, as the king hadn't seen the last of the rebellion against him. Only a year later, Henry's father returned from exile with the force of another revolt behind him. Taking the throne by force, he imprisoned the former King Richard and began his reign as the new monarch. In a flash, Henry had become the heir apparent as his father took the throne, receiving the title of Prince of Wales, as well as Duke of Lancaster. He was educated at the Queen's College in Oxford, where he developed a burning passion for music, as well as reading and writing. In fact, he became the first English king to receive an education in the Middle English vernacular. As heir to the English throne, even at his young age, Henry's future became more scrutinised, namely the possibility of marriage. At first, Isabella of Valois was the chosen candidate, despite being the widow of the usurped King Richard II. When this didn't work out, Catherine of Pomerania became the next choice, but negotiations in the early 1400s failed. He was only a teenager when he got an early taste of combat, leading his own army. Tasked with suppressing several revolts, he also fought alongside his father in 1403 at the Battle of Shrewsbury. It was during this conflict that Henry experienced a terrifying close call. Although he showed an aptitude for command, he was also very inexperienced, and this may have almost led him to an early grave. During the Battle of Shrewsbury, one of the enemy arrows pierced him in his left cheekbone, creating a wound that would have been fatal for many during the 15th century. But unlike those who fought alongside him, Henry's royal blood granted him medical care of the highest quality. He received an operation performed by the royal physician, who used honey as an antiseptic and a device of his own making to remove the arrowhead. Henry survived, but the scars he sustained would last forever. Even before that gruesome battle in Shrewsbury, Henry had been fighting against other uprisings in Wales. The conflict had begun in 1400, and he continued to lead his army against the Welsh until 1408. As the years passed, the health of Henry's father began to decline, as he suffered from a skin disease that may have been leprosy, and attacks that some believe were signs of epilepsy. Stepping up to help his father, Henry took an increasing interest in the kingdom's politics, and all but controlled the government by 1410. Henry was still young and inexperienced, but he had the counsel of his two uncles to help him make difficult decisions concerning the government. His father's policies frequently contrasted with Henry's, and it became normal for the two to argue over how to handle issues. Henry's father's health only worsened over the next few years until 1413, when he died on March 20th. Henry's coronation occurred the following month, but was accompanied by a strange event. While he received his crown, a blistering snowstorm blew in, prompting the question of whether it was a good or bad omen. King Henry V's reign had just begun, but there was no doubt that he had a target on his back. The year 1414 saw Henry's good friend, John Oldcastle, branded a heretic and pushed to revolt against him. A year later, several noblemen conspired to replace him with the Earl of March. In both cases, Henry quashed their attempts. Although he became known for the extent of his mercy and patience, he also demonstrated early on that he was not one to be trifled with. This was the case with his former friend and ultimate betrayer, John Oldcastle, whom Henry showed no mercy. He executed Oldcastle in 1417 by burning him at the stake, putting an end to his revolt and discouraging any others. Meanwhile, a much larger conflict loomed on the horizon. From the time of King Richard II up till 1415 during Henry's reign, England and France had enjoyed a brief period of peace, but the king's ambition threatened to change that. Through his mother's bloodline, Henry had a claim to the French throne. However, since France's succession laws prohibited women, they denied his assertion. Decades before Henry's birth, his great-grandfather, King Edward III, had made a claim to the French throne. This resulted in a conflict between England and France that lasted around 116 years, but included sporadic periods of peace. Henry resumed the conflict in 1415. Fueled by ambition and pride, he sailed his armies across the English Channel to begin his campaign in France that summer. Targeting the fortress at Harfleur, their siege lasted about a month until they finally captured it, but at a steep cost. Conditions had been so poor that Henry lost about a third of his men to dysentery. Despite his losses, Henry's victory inspired him to push further into France. He marched his remaining forces on for another month, but once they got close to the village of Agincourt, they stopped in their tracks as a French army advanced against them. Henry's army had been reduced to 9,000 men at most, which he expected would be enough to conquer any challenge they met. However, this thinking may have changed when he saw the intercepting army of between 12 and 30,000 Frenchmen. The outnumbered Englishmen likely saw the vast army approaching and feared the worst. But the previous night had brought down a heavy downpour, leaving a mess of thick mud for the French to become trapped in. This made it easy for the English archers to pick them off. Losing their men left and right, the French resolved to charge the English bowmen on horseback, but this too proved fatal. As soon as they got close, the first ones to reach the English line instead found their horses stopped by a barrier made of wooden stakes. Despite the incredible odds stacked against him, Henry's army emerged victorious. Not only did the Battle of Agincourt give Henry's claim more legitimacy and mark his greatest triumph, but even as the kingdoms continued to fight after his time, it remained a standout victory in the larger conflict. Henry continued his march through France until the following month, then he returned to England as a hero. His victory at Agincourt had spurred growing nationalism in England, and his return was met by a rapturous crowd of at least 20,000 people. While the Battle of Agincourt would stand out as one of the greatest English victories against France, it had more immediate benefits. Not only was the morale of Henry's forces strengthened, but it had the opposite effect on the French army. The impact that Henry's victories had on his people soon became a part of his legacy, and the nationalism that he inspired would last far beyond the span of his life. Becoming a symbol of English patriotism, his effect would be felt by both the medieval armies of later kings and the British army as a whole for hundreds of years. While England was busy celebrating, France and its sympathisers were scrambling to figure out how to end the conflict before they lost any more. So it happened that King Sigismund of Hungary took a trip to England to try to change Henry's mind about his specific demands in an effort to move toward peace. Henry could have turned King Sigismund away, but he knew their friendship would be worth much more. So he played nice, giving Sigismund all the luxuries befitting a royal guest and discussing how England could help him in the future. After a matter of months, Sigismund signed the Treaty of Canterbury, which supported Henry's claim. Through this kind of diplomacy, Henry ensured that he maintained the upper hand. His dealings with King Sigismund became even more integral to his campaign against France, considering Sigismund soon assumed the role of Holy Roman Emperor. This meant that through the Treaty of Canterbury, Henry had deprived France of one of its strongest supporters and taken that alliance for England instead. No matter how beneficial or impactful Henry's previous victories had been, they'd also taught him about which parts of his strategies were lacking. As such, he spent the following couple of years preparing to once again march into France. returning to the kingdom in 1417 with far greater plans. This campaign began with a swift and fierce attack. Leading his new campaign, Henry practically gave the French no time to breathe as he and his army surged through each of their objectives. After a nearly month-long siege, they captured the town of Caen and proceeded through Lower Normandy before assailing the city of Rouen and cutting it off from Paris. This marked another dark spot in Henry's shining legacy. Henry didn't display a shred of mercy during the siege. Instead, the people of Rouen only saw a king both cold and unfeeling. The city's officials sent the women and children out, as there wasn't enough food, and they hoped Henry would let them pass. But he was stubborn and declined the request, leaving the refugees to starve outside the city gates. Henry's success wasn't only because of the strength of his army, but also from his tact in playing his enemies against each other. Unfortunately for France, this was too easy, as England wasn't the only issue they faced. The Armagnac-Burgundian civil conflict was in full swing, and while he continued his more militaristic tactics, Henry used the conflict to debilitate the French further. Making his way through the country and winning every major battle along the way, he finally arrived outside Paris in August 1419. Rather than continue the endless bloodshed, the French negotiated the Treaty of Troyes and acknowledged Henry's claim. Through the treaty, the son of King Charles VI lost his inheritance of the throne, with Henry becoming heir apparent. As for Charles' daughter Catherine, Henry married her on June 2nd, 1420. Not long after his wedding, Henry returned to England with his new queen. During that time, the Duke of Clarence, Henry's brother, had remained in France and continued to fight. He was killed in the Battle of Bauge in March 1421. Naturally, Henry wanted vengeance. The Battle of Bauge had ended in a particularly crushing defeat for the English, prompting Henry to launch back into battle to set things straight. Sailing to France that summer, he spent the rest of the year in 2 lengthy sieges, both ending in English victory. Henry and the King of France had reached an agreement and solidified it with a treaty, but to many of the French locals, the peace was no more than the result of empty politics. Therefore, to actually establish his eventual rule in France, Henry continued to fight against independent resistance groups. Only a few weeks after the second of Henry's 2 sieges in late 1421, he came down with an illness, the nature of which is still unknown. Henry wasn't resigned to his deathbed just yet, but he did take some time to recuperate before leading his men in another battle at Consolidating. He soon realised that he should have stayed in bed. With a full suit of armour in the middle of a French summer, it wasn't long before he was struck down with illness again. Henry and his forces were victorious in this final battle as the resisting army soon retreated. Henry's health only declined further, and sailing back to England was out of the question. Instead, he returned to Vincennes, confined to his deathbed for several more weeks. Seeing his last days drawing closer, and since his son was only 9 months old, he named his older brother, the Duke of Bedford, as England's regent until the king came of age. After weeks of suffering, King Henry V died on August 31st, 1422, which was especially unlucky considering what happened next. After all that fighting, Henry had won France's recognition of his claim to the throne, but was only set to inherit it after the death of Charles VI. This happened on October 21st the same year, just 2 months after Henry died. For centuries after his reign, Henry's legacy continued to have a lasting impact on the British Army, but his story also gained prominence in less militaristic endeavours. Many literary greats in history have adapted his story in some way, with the most famous being William Shakespeare, who wrote a play based on the king's life, aptly named Henry V. Henry may not have always been the just king that history made him out to be, but even during his time, people were willing to overlook some of his darker moments. Following his death, the majority of the English public were eager to immortalise him as peerless among Christian kings and princes. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.